of India, His Excellency Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden, Mr. Nicholas Pinault, the G7 and G20 Sherpa to the OECD. I welcome you all. Thank you for joining us. Multilateralism is one of the 5 themes at Raisina Dialogue this year. Understanding how multilateralism works, how it is evolving, how it is being shaped by global developments and international relations is key for us into designing a new approach towards global governance. Of course, plurilateralism and even minilateralism is not new, but it has certainly gained some momentum. It has emerged now as a preferred approach to transnational governance. Perhaps there's an effort to rehabilitate plurilateralism, which was otherwise frowned upon a few decades ago. It seems, though, that plurilateralism is more flexible, swift, informal, perhaps even a more effective grouping of like-minded nations. But it is clear that it is less inclusive. Compared to the more inclusive, more representative, structured, legally binding, and a largely consensus-based multilateral approach to global governance. So that this session, we are here to explore whether plurilateralism and minilateralism have now become the new norms of global governance. Is plurilateralism likely to fragment global cooperation, or is it likely to strengthen global cooperation by becoming an intermediate step? Does plurilateralism lend itself more naturally to certain issues, perhaps more to political and security issues than economic, or vice versa? And what impact does plurilateralism have on existing institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, WTO and IMF, that were set up with the intention of having a more broad-based consensus to global governance? So with that, my first question actually it would be to Ambassador Shringla. Ambassador Shringla, what is your approach? Do you think plurilateralism has now become the new norm for global governance? Is multilateralism passé?
Thank you, Akshay. And let me first of all start by saying what a pleasure it is to be a part of the Raisina Dialogue, and great honor to be with such eminent participants as we have on this panel. We, of course, would have been delighted to have our participants and those who are listening in on our conversation in person in Delhi. But then I think we will have to make the best of the situation, and I think digital, the digital age gives us the opportunity to have much the same results as we would have had otherwise. On the issue, of course, on the issue of plurilateralism versus multilateralism, I think that was the essence of your question. Let me preface this by saying in very general terms that, countries, when they want to engage with their external interlocutors, their partners, would try and find the most effective and appropriate formats, to engage in that regard. They could be bilateral, they could be multilateral, they could be plurilateral, and as you said, they could be minilateral. Let's take a few examples in the case, and I'll try and give you our own experience in India to try and put this in perspective. I think if you look at the issues, and you talked about economic issues versus political and security issues, when you talk about issues, let's say, I think nowhere has the need to consult, cooperate, and coordinate with other states being felt as greatly as during the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, this crisis is one that has global dimensions. It has, of course, it also has regional dimensions because, groups of countries are affected differently from other players. But clearly, it is not within the capacity of any one state to deal with it. It needs very, very extensive cooperation and collaboration. And in our case, we, I think, saw the writing on the wall fairly early. In fact, it was Prime Minister Modi who convened the first meeting of SAARC, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation leaders, even before, lockdown was thought of early in March, and said, let's work to see how we can cooperate regionally in dealing with this crisis. I mean, none of us really know what this is leading up to. How can we work together and cooperate? And this was, I think, the first time that the SAARC met in quite some time, and all the all the leaders joined in. And I think there were some very good results because the leaders decided to have a SARC emergency, COVID emergency response fund. All countries cooperated to the fund. We contributed $10 million. Others contributed in different amounts that suited them. But what was important was that it led to cooperation, real exchange of information between health professionals. There were training sessions. There was mutual self-support. We provided a lot of health-related equipment through the SARC emergency COVID fund. And it was a great example of regional cooperation. Even if countries didn't see eye to eye on political or security issue, they could come together and work on a humanitarian issue of this nature. Then the Prime Minister himself took the initiative of proposing a G20 extraordinary summit to be convened on the COVID crisis. Saudi Arabia, which was the chair, I think readily agreed. And then we had a G20 summit that took, again, in my view, some very meaningful decisions. One of them was the debt service suspension initiative, which really said that the G20 has to consider, let's say, economic condition of many of the developing countries, least developing countries who could not pay back their debts. I know it worked very well for us because when countries came to us and said, look, we can't pay back our loans, our finance ministry was more than ready because we already had a structural institutional agreement on that we would suspend, the debt repayment part. But Prime Minister Modi in his intervention made a very good point. He said the G20, and this intervention was not public because these were in-house meetings. I know Mr. Pino would have been part of that. But he said that the G20 was created for financial and economic crises. For the first time, the G20 was meeting on what is essentially a humanitarian crisis. And I think this is where, countries have to come closer together. And G20 is the best place to do that because it provides 80% of the world's GDP. It has 60% of the world's population. It is an organization of the most powerful countries and can take decisions that provide the resources and the direction which can be useful for all concerned. And another example is the Quad, the first Quad summit that took place recently. And now the Quad, is associated with various different, facets of its functioning with regard to the Indo-Pacific. But for the first time, again, the Quad took a decision that they would come up with a vaccine initiative whereby, they would utilize India's manufacturing capacity with funding from Japan and the United States to produce vaccines for the Indo-Pacific region, in particular Southeast Asia. And Australia would provide the last mile support and logistical support for that vaccine initiative to produce about 1 billion doses of vaccine by 2022. So again, it's a plurilateral initiative, but it's not just plurilateral. We are members. We are now currently the chair of the World Health Assembly. We are part of the WHO's independent panel for pandemic preparedness and response. We worked closely with Gavi. We've worked closely with the UN and its different bodies on vaccine development, supply, and in dealing with this crisis. So, as far as India is concerned, we are part of multiple groupings, beginning, of course, with the UN, its specialized agencies, but extending to plurilateral constructs such as BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Quad, and then smaller, trilateral groupings such as BRIC, which is Russia, India, China, or JER, which is Japan, America, India. It's really up to you in which groups of countries you want to collaborate with, but you use those groupings to the maximum effect and where they're most appropriate, as I said. And as far as we are concerned, we would like to work in close cooperation with all concerned on our regional, multilateral, and global responsibilities. So this is just to put it in context. I know there'll be more follow-up questions, but I just wanted to put things in perspective from India's point of view.
Thank you, Ambassador Shringla. I'd move to you, Your Excellency Carl Bildt. Is geopolitics shaping our choices for plurilateralism versus multilateralism? What are the developments that are taking place in the world that are different now, that may be nudging nations, influencing nations to perhaps choose one way or the other, choose plurilateralism over multilateralism? How should we read into this? What are some of the global developments that are shaping this choice?
Well, the global development that we've seen, I think we're all aware of it, is that for quite some time we've seen geopolitical tension rising. I mean, that could be in the global scale, that could be regional scale, and that, of course, is affecting also areas that are sort of without the or outside the immediate subject political tensions. If we go back, say, a quarter of a century, 25 years in time, we were in an era where everyone was dreaming of a new age of multilateralism. After the bipolar world had collapsed, there was a new age of cooperation and the UN and Security Council and all of the above. And as we look at developments during the past quarter of a century, we know that well, some of that happened, some of it didn't. And we have seen a situation where, of course, the UN Security Council is often blocked again, as we saw during previous years, and where it has been somewhat more difficult to get nations together on key issues. You can say the trade issues can be one example of that. At the same time, we are now living in a situation where we see the imperative of working together on a global scale. I mean, the climate issue is an obvious one. I mean, we can't have a solution to the climate issue in just a limited group of countries. Doesn't really work. And the health issue has brought forward or brought to the front very much the vulnerabilities that we feel when there is not a sufficiently robust international mechanism. So what we see now is, I think, a resurgence in belief or in the necessity of global framework or global agreements or global whatever in order to address these major global challenges. Within that, of course, you can see plurilateral groupings that are trying to do their part of the entire aspect, but within that broader global framework. The Foreign Secretary indicated some of the issues on the global health side. I'm involved in that. I'm sort of nowadays a special envoy for the World Health Organization for what is called Act A, where we bring together in a formal network all of the major actors, vaccines and therapeutics and testing and whatever, in order to make certain that this is available everywhere, because we know that no one is safe until everyone is safe. You can't do it in just Sweden or India or France. It's simply not going to work. So there you have it. We also see the possibility of having perhaps hybrid solutions. Just to take one example, which I think is interesting from my part of the world, the Arctic Council. The Arctic issues are coming more in the forefront with the climate change and the melting of the Arctic ice and the possibility of new sea routes. And then we have the Arctic Council. That is composed of the 7 Arctic states exclusively, but based explicitly on international law, on the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. So you have a group of nations, that's plurilateral you can say, operating on basis of international law and multilateral agreements. And I think that might well be a solution that we will see more. Groups of nations doing things together where it's more appropriate or where possible, but based on broader global understandings. And let me just finally add that we are in an age of huge developments of science and technology. And what we clearly need are new global frameworks and new global understandings when it comes to issues from cyberspace to outer space. And that also underlines that these issues that we need to do in as broad a framework as possible, but where groups of nations obviously can take initiatives and be driving in that direction.
Nicholas, let me turn to you. You are the Sherpa for, I suppose, 2 mini-laterals, if I may, but also working for a plurilateral in a way, so OECD, if you consider that as a plurilateral. So I suppose we'd like to hear your experience. OECD is doing a lot of work as in support function for the G20. You're doing work on tax issues. There's been so much work that's happened on global standards. Does plurilateralism provide an intermediate step to a more broad-based multilateral framework? Or does that intermediate step typically take place, is effective, it is instituted, but it does not go any further than what it is supposed to go? What has your experience been?
Thank you for first of all the invitation. It's a great honor to be contributing to this discussion and to be with such distinguished panelists. As you said, Chair, we are living in a world that is extremely polarized, very fragmented. Prime Minister Bildt insisted on this aspect. The world is very polycentric right now. And this, of course, has a bearing on the multilateral conversation. So what is at stake is really to make multilateralism work in this context, and not be dogmatic about plurilateral versus multilateral. And from that perspective, I would say the crisis that we have just that we are living, the COVID crisis, is actually showing that there were cracks in multilateralism. In fact, before the crisis, there was this historical failure of the Doha round at the start of 2000. There were also difficulties in the reform of the Bretton Woods institution before this crisis. There were also, as the crisis has highlighted, difficulties with the WHO. So the crisis, the COVID crisis, in a way, was a sort of a magnifier of all of that. It was really revealing in terms of the weaknesses of the multilateral system. And I think that plurilateralism is actually a way to find a sort of a working alternative to those difficulties of the multilateral system. And plurilateralism is not undermining multilateralism. It's actually offering a way to compensate the weaknesses of the multilateral system at a specific juncture. And you mentioned the tax agenda. I think it's a beautiful example. Indeed, the OECD has worked very closely with the G20 to put in place a number of light institutions. Prime Minister Bildt mentioned ACTA and COVAX. I would say in the area of tax, we had the Global Forum on Tax Transparency that we put in place during the Great Financial Crisis. Then to tackle tax evasion, then we put in place the BEPS inclusive framework. And this inclusive framework is now working very actively to tackle the issue of digitalization of the economy and related tax issues. These are very flexible forms of multilateralism. And as you said, they start with countries that are willing to cooperate on those issues, but they are, and this is very important, they are open architecture. So they are architecture that every country can join, as long as they are willing to cooperate. And I think that somehow the future of multilateralism is there. This is about convening flexible platforms to address specific issues. It can be vaccines, as was mentioned. It can be taxation. It can be steel excess capacity. We set up with the G20 and with the OECD hosted the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity, which is still up and running, unfortunately without China, but I think it's still a very useful platform. So this is this kind of, I would say, more ad hoc multilateralism that we need to explore more forcefully. Obviously, this might not be fully satisfactory, and there are a number of issues like climate, like health, where we need really to have global institutions because we need to have all countries on board. We cannot afford to have free riders, so we need to have truly universal platforms to tackle those issues. But on a number of other issues, we need to explore more flexible avenues, more flexible vehicles to tackle this kind of collective issues. So indeed, plurilateralism can be an alternative, a complement to the more formal multilateral system. And let me say that multilateralism is an instrument. This is not in itself a dogma. This is a tool. We should not be, how can I say, theologic about multilateralism. If multilateralism doesn't work the way it used to work with, for instance, the institutions that were set up after World War II, we need to explore alternative forms which are more flexible and perhaps more specific in their scope.
Ambassador Shringla, of course, India has a long history of engaging with the world, also especially in Bretton Woods institutions, including the WTO, which came up in the 90s. We have been good citizens of the multilateral institutions. More lately, we have seen, including from the current foreign minister, but otherwise, more issue-based partnerships, I think, is the phrase that we have often used in India. How does one choose which approach to pursue? And what are some of the determinants of that approach? Do certain issues lend themselves better for a plurilateral approach than others? Or is there another way to think about this?
Let me approach the issue that you raised in a slightly different manner. When you have, I mean, the question that I have in mind, which is really in response to what you just mentioned, is that why is there a greater evidence of plurilateral and minilateral, let's say, meetings and confabulations? I mean, why is there a resort to this? And you had given various, aspects of that question in terms of response. But essentially, if you have countries that are coming together outside of, what we have, in terms of a formal setup, which is the UN and its agencies and subsidiary bodies, etc., meeting to take decisions which the UN itself really is charged to do and is responsible for taking those decisions. Then you would ask the question as to why that is happening. And one of the possible responses, which has been just discussed a short while ago, is really the lack of effectiveness of some of the organs of the United Nations, particularly those that do not have a representative character, or those that have not evolved since the UN was created, 75 years ago at the end of the Second World War. After all, the Security Council, the permanent members are the victors of the Second World War. But we've come a long way since, and the world has changed greatly. And if you don't have the means of ensuring that there is representation of countries that can make that contribution to global peace and security, then that decision-making will shift elsewhere. And so you could have similar decisions, perhaps more effectively out of the Quad or the G7 or the G20. I'm just putting it I'm generalizing, I'm not being specific here. But I'm simply, asking a rhetorical question, is that have the Bretton Woods institutions, has the United Nations system created so many years ago, effective today? And in response, India has come up with the concept of reformed multilateralism, which is really a multilateralism that seeks to provide global governance through greater representation, greater voice for countries, that could make that contribution, a greater level of flexibility. It cannot be a rigid system that remains the same. The status quo remains the same for 75 years and you think it still works. It doesn't. And the same countries will resort to other means. And again, I think what I mentioned in the beginning is that, countries will find the most effective and appropriate formats to engage in finding solutions to the important issues that are there with all of us. They could be regional issues, they could be global issues, they could be, subject, sectoral issues, they could be to deal with health, they could be to deal with, security crises, but essentially you will try and find solutions which are most effective and really most convenient for you as a country to engage with. But let me not also take this, let me not say that this is, in many senses, plurilateralism is really going to supplant multilateralism. And I think I agree with Mr. Pino there that plurilateralism really is a supportive format. you take decisions more effectively through a plurilateral format, but ultimately, in order to ensure that they're part of a global governance decision making, which has a sort of approval or let's say the fullest concurrence of all states concerned, you've got to go back to the United Nations, and you've got to go back to formal formats that would endorse decisions taken in different ways. I mean, every country in the world would agree with the debt service suspension initiative. I mean, it's the most logical thing, and but it involved the more wealthy countries to say, yes, we can do it. And then the developing countries are beneficiaries, but all of that can easily be taken back to the to the second committee and then to the General Assembly and said, well, this is a great initiative. So I think both of them work hand in hand, but we need to work a little more to ensure that global governance is more effective, that those formats that are there, created to deal with global governance, are today, I think, reviewed, and we'll have to see what sort of alternative formulations. You needn't completely change them, but you can tinker with them. You certainly need to evolve as you go along. I mean, even in normal life, everybody adjusted, and adapts depending on circumstances. And COVID has been a great game changer, and I think countries really need to, the way we are looking at the WHO, we need to look at the entire United Nations format and see how we can make it forward.
So, Mr. Wilt, I'll come to you with that last comment. There's an evolution that is required. There is clearly a need. Would it be fair to say that when the rules of multilateral order were written, it was written for a broad-based consensus, but again, the rules seem to be, they were written by the West at that time, largely. They seem to favor that way of thinking. Perhaps now that way is not working, even for the West, that the West itself is resorting to plurilateral approaches where once it held multilateral as the way forward. Doha Development Round at the WTO, perhaps an example. Even IMF quota reforms, another example. United Nations Security Council. So perhaps we need to understand that the West also needs to help shape the new institutions that are required for itself as well as for other countries. Would you agree with that formulation?
No, I certainly agree, and I think we all agree that there's a need to constantly reform the institutions. I think we all agree that the Security Council was set up in 1945, reflecting the realities of those days. And if I were to chair the Security Council, I would, India, I would give that a place, and I could say something only if you promise not to tell any Frenchmen about it, but I will have a common place for all of the Europeans under the heading of the EU, for example. That would reflect the realities of the present world. The likelihood of this happening tomorrow is, of course, slight, if I put it in those terms. And reform of Bretton Woods institutions has been a slightly slow process, but clearly necessary. I think what we are discussing here could perhaps be described as the need for pluralism with a multilateral perspective, or pluralism within a multilateral framework. That is, groups of nations taking initiatives and doing things, respecting international law, respecting the multilateral framework, and often with the wish, the perspective, and the desire to make what they agree on being something that is agreeable to the world as a whole. This is outside the security sector, which is somewhat different. So that is, I think, where we're heading. A pluralism that is not necessarily undermining multilateralism, but is trying to do what is not immediately possible within the multilateral framework, but retaining the wish, the perspective, and the policy aim of making this multilateral at the end of the day. And that is often the case. I think we can see quite a number of those initiatives that are taken by limited groups of states, taking the forward position, so to say, on different issues. You could say an extreme example of this is, of course, the G20. The G20, extremely powerful in terms of the composition, but still not multilateral. But, of course, what the G20 decide, they wish that to be something for the entire world. So that is powerful pluralism. with a clear multilateral perspective. And the same, I think, we can see in quite a number of different areas. That might be the way which the world is going to be proceeding as we go ahead in this age of also the increasing geopolitical tensions and the effect that that's having.
Thank you. So, Nicholas, you did mention that plurilateralism a step. I think you were in broad agreement with the others that it is one of the instruments that nations have, not necessarily, you don't have to necessarily choose an approach right away, but like Mr. Bill said, maybe it's the most immediate step forward. Do you think that the United Nations could have done what G20 did for the transatlantic financial crisis? Or could the United Nations have done what the G20 has done for the post-COVID economic recovery with DSSI and the inclusive framework? Could it have been possible, or what's your perspective?
I don't think so, to be perfectly frank and to be perfectly blunt. I think this is precisely what makes the G20 so important, that somehow the G20, this is a powerful political shell. In itself, it's a bit of an empty shell, but it deals with certain issues, and it has this ability to provide a political momentum, to give a political impetus to certain issues. This is what happened during the Great Financial Crisis, where the G20 put all of its political weight behind the reform of the international financial architecture and of the prudential regulation framework. This is not something that the UN could have done, but it's also linked to the specific features of the G20. It's somehow this is a sort of a steering committee of the global economy. As the Foreign Secretary said, you have there 80% of global GDP, 80% of trade, 80% of foreign direct investment. So obviously, what the G20 decides has a strong bearing on the multilateral conversation. But the interesting thing is to see that the G20 in itself is not making decisions as such. The G20 is forging a political consensus around certain solutions, but then those solutions are brought to the formal multilateral system. On the DSSI, for instance, that was mentioned by the Foreign Secretary, this is the IMF and the World Bank that are actually designing the technical solutions and the policies to be implemented to support developing countries. Whatever the G20 decides on tax is actually worked out at a technical level by the OECD in the Global Forum on Tax Transparency or in the inclusive BEPS framework. And whatever the G20 discusses on trade needs to be brought to the WTO and agreed by all members in the WTO. So the G20 really, I think, is part indeed of this flexible global governance that we are discussing here. It's a sort of incubator, a place where political decisions at a very high level are done, where the consensus can be crafted, and then it can be brought to other fora in the multilateral system. This is how it works. I see that as a very big and very powerful political incubator, in fact.
A powerful incubator indeed. Ambassador Shringla, I'll give you the last word. And the question would be to give us the long view from India. As we look forward, what are some of the issues, what are some of the attributes that are likely to shape India's thinking on multilateralism or plurilateralism? In fact, you've actually helped us, when you set the context, you said bilateral, trilateral, quad, so that's already 2, 3, and 4, and plus minilateral, plurilateral. So India is engaged I think your opening point was India is engaged at all levels. So looking at the long view, what should we from India be expecting? What are some of the determinants of how this is going to shape going forward? Plurilateralism versus multilateralism, or even bilateralism for that matter.
Touch upon a quick point, and that is, when we had the onset of the COVID pandemic, we were really confronted with the breakdown of global governance. As many of us would recall, most of our, even developed countries ran out of essential health equipment. You found that your supply chains were not as reliable as you thought they were. Sources of supply that you took for granted, whether they were APIs or they were test kits or they were ingredients of different health equipment, were not forthcoming. There was a scramble for these, and I do remember that countries scrambled. There was an unseemly scramble for these scarce resources. You see that also in the case of vaccines. There is a very limited supply of vaccines, and although we supply majority of the world's vaccines, we still haven't come up to the speed in terms of the requirements that are there, both domestically and globally, to meet that global demand. Because I think the global community hasn't prepared for a pandemic of this nature. And that is what we really need to think, that as we go along, what is the sort of global governance architecture that we need that will prepare us for non-traditional challenges, which are not necessarily, interstate conflict, but pandemics, epidemics, cross-border terrorism, all sorts of issues that you have to deal with in today's world. And I think that is very important. And of course, as you go along, I think countries have realized that it is important to develop your own capacities. We have a term for it called Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is basically self-reliance. You rely on creating your own, its sort of inherent chains and your inherent manufacturing capacities. I'll give you an example. When we started with COVID, we found that in the entire country, there were only 14,000 ventilators for a country of 1.3 billion. Today, we're talking about 450,000 ventilators. The point is that you have to have the capacity to manufacture, not just for yourselves, but for the overall global good. And every country can contribute in that way. I mean, I'm giving one example, but we need to contribute. So the architecture as you go along, I think, has to be both plurilateral and multilateral. And wherever possible, the plurilateral system has to support the multilateral system. I think that is important. But you need to bring in the essential reforms in the multilateral system if you don't want it to break down completely in the form of plurilateral and minilateral, groupings and constructs all over the world that will then not only undermine, international order as we know it, but would also, in some senses, supplant it. This is the point that Prime Minister Bildt had made earlier, that at this point of time, we are not doing that, but unless there is reform, and unless we see the world going in a certain direction, which is a reformed multilateralism, I think you will have those problems. As far as India is concerned, we will engage. Definitely, we are committed to the multilateral system, but we will also engage plurilaterally. We will engage everywhere where it gives us an advantage, where it's effective, and where it is, I think, convenient for us to engage.
I think with that last statement, there is really no need for me to summarize, because you've done that for us, Ambassador Shringla. All that's left for me is to thank you for joining us for this session at Raisina Dialogue. Ambassador Shringla, thank you. Also, for our viewers, you are the co-host of this conference. So thank you, Ambassador Shringla. Your Excellency Carl Bildt, thank you for joining us. Nicholas Pinaud, thank you very much, and all the best. G20 has an important year ahead of us, so we wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.